Thyra Velshen did not want this assignment, and she made no effort to hide that fact from anyone who cared to ask. She stood at the observation window of Transport Shuttle 9 as it docked with Station Olmara. Her forearms folded tightly across her chest, her bioluminescent skin flickering in dull shades of amber that any Valori would recognize as irritation. She was a liaison commander of the Galactic Concorde, a decorated officer, an empath of the highest caliber, and they had sent her to evaluate humans. Humans, the soft-skinned newcomers who had barely been part of the Concorde for a standard decade, who came from a mid-tier death world that most galactic cartographers had not even bothered to name until recently, who were known across the stars for exactly nothing remarkable at all. She had read the briefing files on the transport ride over. Humans were classified as Class C endurance predators, with moderate intelligence and an unusual talent for persistence, which was a polite way of saying that they were too stubborn to know when to quit, and too fragile to survive the consequences of that stubbornness. The shuttle doors hissed open, and Thyra walked into Station Olmara's main concourse, where the air smelled like recycled oxygen and metal polish. The station was a joint military garrison, home to 12 different species serving under the Concorde's unified command structure, and it hummed with the organized chaos of several hundred soldiers going about their routines. Her guide was a nervous Pelori administrator named Ven, who had clearly been told to make a good impression. He walked her through the garrison's training wings one by one, and Thyra let her empathic senses drift outward, like invisible tendrils, tasting the emotional signatures of each species as they passed. The Kralith wing came first, those massive reptilian warriors with their natural bone-plated armor and tails thick enough to crush steel. She watched a group of them smashing training dummies into clouds of synthetic dust, roaring with each strike, and through her empathy she felt their emotions burning hot and vivid. Raw aggression, tribal pride, the deep and ancient hunger of apex predators who had never once, in their evolutionary history, been prey. She nodded with quiet respect. Next came the Orvani, tall and willowy beings with 6 eyes and powerful telekinetic abilities. They lifted enormous weights with nothing but their minds, bending metal rods into spirals with casual flicks of concentration. Thyra felt their emotions as well, cool, precise, like the hum of a perfectly tuned machine, impressive in a different way. The Felhari demonstrated their speed, blurring through obstacle courses so fast that Thyra's eyes could barely track them. The Doer showed their incredible regenerative abilities, and one of them actually severed his own arm during a demonstration, only for it to begin regrowing within minutes. Every species had something extraordinary, some gift of biology, some edge forged by millions of years on their home worlds. And by the time Ven led her to the human section of the garrison, Thyra had already mentally written her evaluation. Then they arrived, and Thyra's expectations were confirmed in the worst possible way. The human training area was small, modest, and strikingly plain compared to every other wing she had visited. There were no dramatic displays of power, no roaring demonstrations of strength. Instead, she found a group of about 40 humans doing what they called PT, physical training, which apparently consisted of running in circles, lifting weighted bars, and hitting each other while wearing padded gloves. Thyra watched them with her empathic senses wide open, searching for something, anything, that might surprise her. What she found was calm, steady focus, the emotional equivalent of a quiet heartbeat. No fire, no fury, no predatory edge, just discipline and patience, and a strange sense of unity that connected them all like threads in a web. She turned to Ven and said, "Where is the commanding officer of this section?" Ven pointed to the far end of the training room, where a single human male was working with a heavy bag, a large cylinder of packed material that hung from a chain. The man struck it with his bare fists in slow, rhythmic combinations, each impact landing with a deep thud that Thyra could feel through the floor. "That is Sergeant Ethan Rourke," Ven said. "He runs the human combat training program." Thyra studied him as she approached. He was average height by human standards, which made him short compared to most species on the station. His build was solid but not imposing. His skin was a weathered tan, and his dark hair was cut close to his skull. There was nothing about him that would make anyone look twice, except for his hands. His knuckles were a map of old scars, thick and white against his skin, layered one on top of another, like the rings of an ancient tree. These were not the hands of a man who had been in a few fights. These were the hands of someone who had been fighting his entire life. He noticed her and stopped, pulling his fists back and giving her a short nod. "Commander Vel Shen," he said, "they told me you were coming. Welcome to our corner of the station." His voice was calm and even, and through her empathy, Thyra felt nothing unusual from him, just a steady warmth and quiet alertness, like an animal resting but never truly asleep. She asked him the standard questions: combat readiness, tactical specialties, integration with other species. He answered each one directly, and without any attempt to inflate his words or boast about his soldiers. When she asked what made humans valuable in a combat role, he paused for a moment and then said, "We show up and we do not stop. That is about the simplest way I can put it." Showing up was not a combat trait. It was what species without real combat traits said to make themselves feel relevant. She noted the scars on his knuckles again and asked, "Those marks on your hands, how did you get them?" He looked down at his fists as though he had forgotten they were there, and then he said with a small shrug, "Old habits." That night, Thyra sat in her quarters and composed her preliminary evaluation. She chose her words carefully, but her conclusion was clear. Humans displayed no remarkable combat capabilities, no biological advantages worth noting, and no tactical specialization that could not be better filled by any of the 11 other species on Station Olmara. She recommended that they be assigned limited auxiliary roles: logistics, communications, support, and nothing more. She sent the report and felt satisfied that this assignment would be over soon. But over the next few days, a different kind of storm was building on the station, and its name was Warlord Drask Gorin. Drask was a Kralith war boss, a veteran of 30 campaigns, and the most decorated combat officer on Station Olmara. He stood nearly 8 feet tall, his body covered in natural bone armor that could stop a plasma round, his jaws strong enough to bite through reinforced steel. He was everything that Ethan Rourke was not: massive, terrifying, and impossible to ignore. And he hated humans with a fury that Thyra could feel from across the station. He had been vocal about it since the day humans arrived, calling them prey animals playing soldier, mocking their small bodies and soft skin, demanding that the Concord deny them any combat designation. Most of the station's officers tried to ignore him, but Drask was not a being who could be ignored for long. It happened in the mess hall on the 4th evening of Thyra's stay. She was sitting at a corner table, reviewing data on her holopad, when the room went suddenly quiet. She looked up and saw Drask standing over Ethan Rourke's table, all 8 feet of armored menace, looming above the seated human, like a mountain casting its shadow over a stone. "Little human," Drask growled, his voice like gravel dragged through broken glass. "Tell me why you think you belong here, among warriors." The mess hall was frozen. Hundreds of soldiers from a dozen species, all watching in silence. Thyra felt the room's emotional landscape shift like a tide. Fear from many, excitement from some, cold contempt radiating from Drask like heat from a furnace. Ethan set down his fork, looked up at the Kralith warlord, and said nothing at all. He simply held Drask's gaze, 2 eyes staring into 4, with an expression so calm that it could have been mistaken for emptiness. But Thyra's empathic senses were still open, still reading, and what she felt from the human in that moment made the bioluminescent markings along her arms flare, a sharp, involuntary white. Beneath that quiet surface, something lived inside Ethan Rourke. Something old and controlled, wound so tightly that it vibrated at a frequency she had never encountered in any species. It was not fear, and it was not anger. It was something else entirely, something that had no name in the Valori language, something that coiled and waited and watched with the patience of a creature that had learned over 10 million years that the right moment always comes. Thyra pulled her senses back as though she had touched something hot. She stared at the human across the mess hall, her skin still flickering white, and for the first time since she had arrived on Station Olmara, Liaison Commander Thyra Velshen was not sure what she was looking at. The formal challenge came 2 days after the mess hall confrontation, and when it did, it hit the station like a shockwave. Thyra was in the middle of a briefing with Station Commander Orath, a 6-limbed Pellery with silver-tipped antenna and a permanent expression of bureaucratic exhaustion, when the notification flashed across every holoscreen in the command center. Warlord Dras Gorin had filed a Kaltharak against Sergeant Ethan Rourke of the human contingent. A Kaltharak. Thyra felt her stomach drop when she read the word. It was a Kralith tradition older than interstellar travel, a formal challenge of martial dominance that had been written into the Concord's military charter as a legally binding mechanism for settling disputes between species. The rules were ancient and absolute. 2 warriors, 1 arena, combat until submission or incapacitation. The winner's species gained the right to make a single military demand of the loser's people, and if the challenged party refused to fight, their species forfeited automatically. "He cannot do this," Commander Orath said, his antenna twitching with barely concealed panic. "This is a political maneuver disguised as tradition." But he could do it, and everyone in the room knew it. The Kralith had invoked the Kaltarak 6 times in the last century, and each time the Concord had been forced to honor it. The tradition was sacred to the Kralith, and denying it would risk fracturing the alliance. Within hours, the news had spread across every deck of Station Olmara. Species that had barely acknowledged each other in the corridors were now gathered in clusters, talking in hushed voices about the impossible scenario that was unfolding. A human, one of the weakest species on the station, challenged to single combat by a Kralith war boss, one of the most dangerous living beings in the known galaxy. Thyra went looking for Ethan Rourke and found him exactly where she expected, in the human training area, wrapping strips of cloth around his hands, while his soldiers stood around him with tight, worried faces. "Sergeant Rourke," she said from the doorway, and every human in the room turned to look at her. Ethan glanced up and nodded. "Commander, I figured someone would come talk to me eventually." She stepped inside, and the other humans parted to give her space, their emotions washing over her empathic senses in a wave of anxiety and fierce loyalty. They were afraid for their sergeant, but not a single one of them doubted him. And that contradiction fascinated Thyra, even as it frustrated her. "You understand what a Kaltarak means," she said, keeping her voice even. "I have been reading about it since the mess hall," he replied, pulling the cloth wraps tight with his teeth. "Single combat, no time limit, ends when one fighter submits or cannot continue. Winner species gets to name a demand. Loser species has to accept it. And you understand what Drask will demand if he wins. He will demand that humans be permanently stripped of combat designation and relegated to support roles, effectively making us servants to every other species on this station and in the Concord. Yes, I understand." Thyra studied him. His voice was so calm that it bordered on unsettling, as though they were discussing the weather on some distant colony rather than the potential enslavement of his entire species' military future. "The command staff wants you to use an exosuit," she said, a Mark 7 at minimum, with reinforced plating and integrated weapon systems. They are also willing to authorize a pulse lance or kinetic gauntlets. Ethan shook his head slowly. No. No to which option? No to all of them. No exosuit, no weapons, no armor. The room went very still. Even the other humans looked at their sergeant with wide eyes, and Thyra felt a ripple of shock pass through them, like a stone dropped into water. "Sergeant," Thyra said, and she was careful to keep any trace of condescension out of her voice, even though every rational thought in her head was screaming. "Dras Gorhen is 8 feet tall. He is covered in bone armor that can deflect plasma fire. His bite force can crush industrial steel. His tail alone weighs more than your entire body. And you want to fight him with nothing?" Ethan finished wrapping his hands and stood up. He was not tall. The top of his head barely reached the midpoint of Thyra's chest. But when he looked up at her, there was something in his eyes that made his size irrelevant. "Commander," he said, "my people have been fighting with nothing but their hands since before we had fire. We did it when the predators on our world were bigger and faster and stronger than us in every way that should have mattered. We did it when we had no claws, no fangs, no armor, no venom, nothing but skin and bone and the refusal to die quietly. This is not a disadvantage." He flexed his scarred fingers. "This is who we are." Thyra stared at him for a long moment, and then she did something she rarely did with non-Valori. She reached out with her empathic senses, not casually like she had in the mess hall, but deeply, pushing past the surface of his emotions to try to understand what lived beneath. She hit a wall. Not a psychic barrier. Humans had no psionic abilities whatsoever, but something just as impenetrable. It was discipline, layer upon layer of it, built up over years like stone deposited by a slow and patient river. And beneath that discipline, far below where anyone who was not actively searching would ever feel it, there was heat, a furnace of something vast and old and barely contained, burning at a temperature that made Thyra's empathic senses ache. She pulled back and blinked, her skin flickering through several colors before settling on a pale, unsettled blue. "Very well," she said quietly, "fight however you choose." The next day, the station commander summoned Thyra to his office and informed her that she had been assigned a second role in addition to her evaluation duties. Under Concord military law, every Kaltharok required an empathic witness, a Valori empath who would remain at the edge of the arena during the fight, sensing both combatants' emotional and physical states, and providing official testimony afterward to confirm that neither fighter had been coerced, drugged, or acting under false pretenses. Thyra had served as empathic witness 11 times in her career. She had felt the rage of Kralith berserkers and the ice-cold precision of Orvani duelists. She had felt warriors die and warriors triumph, and everything in between. She was experienced. She was professional, and she was not easily shaken. But when she thought about standing at the edge of that arena and opening her senses to whatever lived inside Ethan Rourke, whatever that furnace was that burned beneath his impossible calm, she felt something she had not felt before any of those previous duels. She felt uneasy. The fight was scheduled for 3 days out, and in those 3 days, Station Ulmara transformed. The central arena, a massive circular pit designed for exactly this kind of event, was cleaned, calibrated, and open to spectators. Delegations from every species on the station requested observation seats, and when those filled up, they requested standing room, and when that filled up, they requested live holo feeds to their quarters. Everyone wanted to watch. The betting markets opened almost immediately, and the odds were so lopsided that most bookmakers refused to take wagers on Ethan at all. A Kralith war boss against an unarmored human was not a fight. It was an execution with extra steps. The only question anyone seemed to be asking was how long the human would last before he was broken. Thyra spent those 3 days observing both fighters from a distance. Drask trained openly, putting on displays that drew crowds, shattering reinforced training pillars with single blows, sparring with 3 Kralith warriors simultaneously, and defeating all of them in under a minute. His emotions were exactly what she expected: burning confidence, predatory anticipation, and a deep contempt for the creature he was about to destroy. Ethan trained alone, behind closed doors, and when Thyra asked his soldiers what he was doing in there, they simply said, "Preparing." On the night before the fight, Thyra could not sleep. She walked the station's corridors in the artificial twilight and found herself standing outside the human training area. The door was slightly open, and through the gap she could see Ethan sitting cross-legged on the floor, in the center of the room, with his eyes closed. He was breathing, slowly, deeply, rhythmically, and through her empathic senses, even from the hallway, Thyra could feel what he was doing. He was reaching down inside himself, past the layers of discipline and calm, down to that furnace she had felt before. And he was not suppressing it or feeding it. He was organizing it, shaping it, making it ready. It was like watching someone sharpen a blade that was already impossibly sharp. She stood there for a long time, and then she went back to her quarters and sat in the dark and thought about every duel she had ever witnessed as an empathic witness. The blood, the fury, the terrible beauty of 2 warriors testing themselves against each other. She had never been afraid before a single one, until now. The morning of the fight arrived, and the arena filled to capacity within an hour. The air hummed with the noise of 1,000 voices from a dozen species, all pressed together in the tiered seating that rose around the central pit like the walls of a crater. Hollow cameras floated overhead, broadcasting the event to every screen on the station. Thyra took her place at the edge of the arena, in the witness alcove, a small open platform with no barrier between her and the fighting floor. She was close enough to touch either combatant if they came near, close enough to feel every emotion, every spike of pain, every heartbeat. She closed her eyes, opened her empathic senses as wide as they could go, and waited. The first to enter was Drask. He came through the eastern gate in full war display. His bone plates flared wide, his throat sac inflated to make him look even larger, his clawed feet striking the arena floor like hammers. He roared, and the sound shook the walls, and the Kralith in the audience roared back in answer. Thyra felt his emotions slam into her like a wave. Pride, hunger, absolute certainty that he was about to crush something small and soft beneath his feet. Then the western gate opened, and Ethan Rourke walked in. He was barefoot. He wore only his standard military fatigues, thin fabric pants, and a sleeveless shirt that left his arms bare. His hands were wrapped in cloth strips, nothing more. He carried no weapon, wore no armor, had no shield, and no technology of any kind. He looked small. He looked fragile. He looked like prey. The crowd murmured, confusion from some, pity from others, mockery from the Kralith section. Thyra heard someone nearby whisper, "Is this a joke?" But Thyra was not listening to the crowd. She was feeling Ethan's emotions as he walked to the center of the arena, and what she felt made every bioluminescent marking on her body flare bright white and then go dark. The furnace was open. He had let it rise, all of it. That vast, ancient, controlled fire that lived at the core of him. And it was not rage, and it was not hatred, and it was not madness. It was something she had no word for in any language she knew. Something that burned with a clarity so intense that it hurt her empathic senses just to be near it. Thyra gripped the railing of her alcove, her 4 hands white-knuckled, her breath shallow, her skin cycling through colors she could not control. She had witnessed hundreds of duels. She had never once been afraid of what she was about to feel. Until right now. The signal horn sounded, a deep, resonant blast that vibrated through the arena floor and up through Thyra's bones. And the Kaltharok began. Drask moved first. He charged across the arena like a landslide given legs, his massive clawed feet cracking the reinforced floor with every stride. His bone-plated arms spread wide to cut off any escape, his jaws opened to show rows of teeth that could shred starship hull plating. The ground shook under his weight, and the crowd erupted in a roar that was half excitement and half primal terror, because watching a Kralith war boss at full charge was like watching a natural disaster accelerate toward a target that had no right to survive it. Thyra braced herself against the railing, her empathic senses flooding with Drask's emotional state. Raw, dominant aggression, the ancient predator confidence of a species that had sat at the top of its food chain for 60 million years. He was not even particularly focused. This was going to be quick, and it was going to be brutal, and he was going to enjoy it. And then Ethan moved. He did not dodge backward or dive to the side the way any sane creature would have. Instead, he stepped forward, into the charge, toward those crushing arms and snapping jaws. And for one frozen instant, Thyra thought he had simply given up and chosen the fastest possible death. But he had not given up. He slipped the charge by inches, his body turning sideways at the last possible moment, so that Drask's massive arm swept past him close enough to ruffle his hair. And in the same motion, with a speed that Thyra's eyes barely caught, Ethan drove his bare fist into a spot just beneath the edge of Drask's left arm plate. A small gap between two sections of bone armor, no wider than 3 human fingers, where a cluster of nerve tissue sat unprotected. The sound it made was sharp and wet, like a hammer hitting packed earth. Drask stumbled. The entire arena went silent. A Kralith warboss, 8 feet of armored predatory perfection, had just stumbled from a single bare-handed strike delivered by a creature half his size. And through her empathic senses, Thyra felt the shockwave of surprise that rippled through Drask's body. Felt the sharp flare of pain from the nerve cluster. Felt the first tiny crack appear in his wall of contempt. And then she turned her senses fully toward Ethan, and everything changed. She had expected to feel rage. Every warrior she had ever witnessed fought with some form of it. Hot anger, cold fury, berserker madness, calculated hatred. Rage was the universal fuel of combat across every species in the Concord, and Thyra had felt every shade of it in her career. What she felt inside him was something that made her four-armed grip on the railing tighten until her joints ached. It was clarity, a focus so absolute and so consuming that it seemed to collapse everything else into a single white-hot point of awareness. His fear was there, she could feel it, but it had been compressed into something dense and useful, converted into alertness the way a machine converts fuel into motion. His pain was there too. The impact with Drask's armor had split the skin across his knuckles. But the pain was not commanding him. It was reporting to him, like a soldier giving status updates to a general who was already 10 steps ahead. She had never felt anything like this from any species. Drask recovered and spun, his tail sweeping low in a strike that should have shattered Ethan's legs. Ethan jumped over it, not with the effortless grace of a Felhari or the telekinetic lift of an Orvani, but with the raw, desperate, perfectly timed athleticism of a creature whose body was not designed for this, and had learned to do it anyway through sheer repetition and will. He landed and immediately closed distance again, driving 2 fast strikes into the hinge point of Drask's right knee. Another gap in the bone armor, another nerve cluster, another vulnerability that no one should have known about unless they had spent months studying Kralith anatomy with the obsessive focus of a predator learning its prey. Drask roared, not in anger this time, but in genuine pain, and swung a backhand that caught Ethan across the chest and sent him flying. Thyra gasped. She felt the impact through her empathic connection, felt Ethan's ribs crack, felt the explosion of pain that ripped through his torso like fire, felt the air driven from his lungs as he hit the arena floor and rolled. It was the kind of pain that should have ended the fight. She had felt warriors surrender from less, had felt beings with far greater physical resilience simply stop when their bodies reported damage this severe. Ethan got up. He got up with blood running from a split in his lip and his left arm pressed against his broken ribs, and Thyra felt his body screaming at him to stop, felt every nerve ending firing distress signals that should have been overwhelming. And she felt him acknowledge the pain and then set it aside like a man closing a door on a noisy room. Something inside Thyra's chest tightened in a way she did not understand. The fight continued, and it became something that no one in the arena had ever seen before. Drask was bigger, stronger, faster, tougher. He was superior in every measurable physical attribute by a factor that should have made this contest meaningless. And yet the human would not fall. Every time Drask hit him, and he hit him often, Ethan took the damage and learned from it. Thyra could feel it happening in real time through her empathic link, could feel his mind processing each exchange with a speed that bordered on terrifying, adjusting his movement, refining his strategy, mapping Drask's patterns and timing with the precision of a machine that ran on blood and willpower. He was not just enduring the beating, he was using it as data. And every time Drask left an opening, no matter how small, Ethan was there, bare fists finding the gaps in that bone armor again and again, striking nerve clusters and joint tissues and the soft places between plates that no fighter had ever targeted, because no fighter had ever needed to learn a Kralith body this thoroughly. Drask landed a devastating overhead strike that drove Ethan to his knees and opened a gash above his left eye. Blood poured down his face, half blinding him. Thyra felt the impact resonate through her own skull, like a bell being struck, and she nearly cried out from the sympathetic pain that flooded her senses. But beneath the pain, beneath the blood and the cracked bones, she felt something from Ethan that terrified her more than any wound. He was still thinking clearly. His mind had not clouded, had not surrendered to panic or desperation, or the survival instinct that should have been screaming at him to stay down and submit and live. Instead, there was that same impossible clarity, that white-hot focus, burning even brighter now, as though the damage to his body was feeding it rather than diminishing it. Thyra began to understand, and the understanding shook her to her core. Every species she had ever studied had a threshold, a point at which pain and damage overwhelmed the mind's ability to continue, a biological failsafe that forced the body to stop fighting and start surviving. It was fundamental to every nervous system in the galaxy. It existed because evolution had determined that an organism that did not know when to stop would destroy itself. Humans had that threshold too. She could feel it in Ethan's biology, could feel the signals his body was sending. He was choosing to ignore it, not suppressing it with chemicals or meditation or psionic tricks, simply choosing, through an act of raw conscious will, to override the most basic survival programming his biology possessed. He was aware that his body was damaged, aware that he was bleeding, aware that every minute he continued to fight brought him closer to permanent injury or death, and he had decided that this was acceptable. His species had evolved the ability to look at their own limitations and say no. The fight had been going on for 12 minutes, an eternity by Kaltharok standards, and something was changing in Drask. Thyra could feel it through her empathic connection, could feel the subtle shift in the Kralith's emotional landscape, like a change in wind direction before a storm. It was small at first, a hairline fracture in the bedrock of his confidence, but it was growing with every exchange. Drask had fought 100 opponents and defeated them all, and every single one of them had eventually shown fear, had eventually broken under his assault, had eventually reached the point where survival became more important than victory. The human had not reached that point. The human did not seem to have that point, and for the first time in his life, Drask Gorhan was not fighting an opponent. He was fighting something he did not understand. And that lack of understanding was eroding his certainty faster than any blow could. Ethan struck again. A combination of 3 rapid punches targeting the nerve cluster beneath Drask's jaw, delivered with hands that were swollen and bleeding, and should not have been able to close into fists anymore. Drask staggered backward, shaking his massive head, and Thyra felt a spike of something she had never felt from a Kralith warrior in combat. Fear. Not of death. Kralith did not fear death, but of something worse. The fear of discovering that you are not what you believed you were. The fear that the universe contains things your understanding cannot accommodate. Ethan closed the distance one final time, and despite his broken ribs, and his bleeding face, and his ruined hands, he moved with a purpose so absolute that it bent the air around him like gravity. He ducked under Drask's desperate swing, stepped behind the massive warrior, and locked both arms around the Kralith's throat. Not around the armored plates, but in the narrow gap between them, where the windpipe and the blood vessels ran unprotected. A rear naked choke, one of the oldest techniques in human martial history, applied to a species that outweighed the human by 500 pounds. Drask thrashed, his tail whipped against the ground, hard enough to crack the floor tiles. His clawed hands reached back to grab at the human clinging to his neck. His bone plates flared and scraped against Ethan's arms, tearing skin and drawing blood. But Ethan held on with a grip that had been forged in a lifetime of refusing to let go. And he squeezed. Thyra was shaking. She was shaking because she was feeling everything. Drask's mounting panic and dwindling oxygen, Ethan's screaming muscles and broken bones, and the terrible, beautiful, inhuman fire of his will, burning so bright that it seared her empathic senses like staring into a star. Tears ran down her face, not from sadness, not from pain, but from an emotion so raw and so alien to her experience that her body did not know how else to express it. She was witnessing something that no Valori had ever felt from the inside, something that redefined what she thought she knew about the limits of living things. Ethan's body was broken. His will had not even flickered. Drask's thrashing grew weaker. His claws dropped to his sides. His massive body swayed. And then, with a sound that was half roar and half gasp, the greatest Kralith warrior on Station Ulmara slammed his open palm against the arena floor 3 times. The signal of submission. The arena was utterly, completely, impossibly silent. Ethan held the choke for 1 more second, just long enough to be certain, and then he released it, unwrapping his bloody arms from Drask's throat and stepping back on legs that should not have been able to hold him upright. He stood there in the center of the arena, barefoot, bare-fisted, drenched in his own blood, with cracked ribs and a fractured orbital bone, and hands so damaged that the fingers could barely uncurl. And for 3 heartbeats, the only sound in the entire station was his breathing. Then the silence broke, and the sound that replaced it was something Thyra would remember for the rest of her life. A roar that came not from the Kralith section or any single species, but from the entire arena. Them together, 1,000 voices raised in the universal language of beings who had just seen something they could not explain and could not deny. Thyra did not join the roar. She stood in her alcove, with tears still wet on her face, and her bioluminescent skin cycling through colors she had never displayed before. And she watched the human sway on his feet, with the furnace still burning inside him, still refusing to go out, still burning as though it had never once in 10 million years of evolution considered the possibility of stopping. And then Ethan Rourke collapsed, and medics from 4 different species rushed onto the arena floor, and Thyra finally allowed herself to breathe. They carried Ethan Rourke out of the arena on a medical stretcher, and Thyra watched them go with her 4 hands still trembling at her sides. The medics moved fast, a pylori trauma surgeon directing traffic, while 2 human field medics and a doer regeneration specialist worked on Ethan simultaneously, their instruments beeping and flashing as they cataloged the damage that his body had absorbed during those impossible 12 minutes in the arena. Thyra heard them calling out injuries to each other as they rushed through the corridors toward the medbay, and every word landed on her ears like a small stone dropping into still water. 3 cracked ribs on the left side, 2 on the right, a fractured orbital bone above the left eye, a hairline fracture in the right cheekbone, severe bruising across the entire torso, consistent with blunt force trauma from a source approximately 10 times the patient's own weight class, multiple lacerations across both forearms from bone plate abrasion, a mild concussion, internal bruising around the liver and left kidney, and blood loss from at least a dozen open wounds. The doer specialist, a being whose species could regrow entire limbs in a matter of hours, looked at the list of injuries and then looked at the unconscious human on the stretcher and said something that Thyra would later include in her official report, word for word. How was this creature still standing? That was the question. That was the question that every being on Station Olmara was asking, in every language, on every deck, in every corridor and mess hall and barracks room. The hollow feeds had broadcast the fight to the entire station, and within hours, clips of it had been transmitted beyond Olmara to the wider Concord network. And the question followed the footage like a shadow. How was he still standing? How did he keep fighting? How did a creature with no armor, and no weapons, and no biological advantages of any meaningful kind, defeat a Kralith warboss in single combat, using nothing but his bare hands? Thyra could have answered them, but she was not ready yet. The answer lived inside her, raw and enormous and unprocessed, and she needed time to shape it into words that other species could understand. She went to the medbay 3 hours after the fight, when the surgeons had finished their work, and Ethan had been moved to a recovery room. She expected to find him unconscious or sedated, or at the very least lying still in the dim light of a healing pod, because that was what warriors from other species did after sustaining injuries like his. They went quiet. They retreated inward. They let the pain consume their attention, while their bodies slowly rebuilt themselves. Instead, she found him sitting up in bed, his ribs wrapped in regenerative bandages, and his face swollen and bruised in shades of purple and yellow, eating a cup of gelatin with his non-dominant hand, because his right hand was immobilized in a stabilizing brace, and he was laughing. His squad was there, 6 human soldiers crowded into the small recovery room, sitting on every available surface, and a few unavailable ones, and they were telling him about the reactions across the station. One of them was doing an impression of a Felhari officer who had apparently fainted during the fight, and another was reading aloud from a message board, where aliens from across the Concord were posting increasingly wild theories about what had just happened. One popular theory claimed that humans had secret internal armor made of compressed calcium, while another insisted that Ethan must be a genetic anomaly, and not representative of his species. Ethan laughed at each one, and the sound of it, warm and easy and entirely unburdened, struck Thyra like a physical blow. She stood in the doorway and stared at him, and she felt a dissonance that she could not immediately resolve. 3 hours ago, she had been inside this man's emotional landscape during the most intense experience of her empathic career, had felt his bones break and his will hold, and his consciousness operate at a level that defied every model of sentient combat psychology she had ever studied. And now he was eating gelatin and making jokes about a Felhari who had fainted. How could a being contain both of those things, that terrifying furnace of focused will, and this simple, ordinary warmth, in the same body, in the same mind, separated by nothing more than a few hours of rest? "Commander," Ethan said, noticing her. He gave her a lopsided smile that was slightly crooked due to the swelling in his jaw. "Come to check on the victor?" "I came to understand something," she said, stepping into the room. The other humans shifted to make space for her, and she felt their emotions shift too. Respect, mixed with curiosity, mixed with something protective. They did not fully trust her yet, but they were willing to give her a chance, because she had stood at the edge of that arena and witnessed what their sergeant had done. She sat in the chair beside his bed and studied his face. The bruises, the stitched gash above his eye, the split lip that was already beginning to scab over. He looked damaged and mortal and breakable, and the memory of what he had felt like from the inside during the fight was so different from what he looked like on the outside that Thyra could not reconcile the two. "How did you endure it?" she asked, and she did not bother specifying what she meant, because they both knew. Ethan was quiet for a moment. The humor faded from his expression, not replaced by anything heavy or dramatic, but by a thoughtfulness that was just as natural as his laughter had been. He looked down at his wrapped hands and flexed his fingers experimentally, wincing slightly at the stiffness. "You just decide you are not done yet," he said. "That is all it ever is. Your body tells you to stop, and you hear it, and you understand that it has good reasons for saying what it is saying. And then you decide that those reasons are not good enough. Not today. Not for this." He looked up at her. Every human learns this at some point in their life. Not all of us in a fighting ring, but all of us somewhere. We learn that the wall our bodies put up is not a wall at all. It is a suggestion, and we can choose to ignore it. Some of us learn it the first time we run until we cannot breathe, and then keep running. Some of us learn it when someone we love is in danger, and our body finds strength it was not supposed to have. It is not special. It is the most human thing there is. Thyra absorbed this in silence, her empathic senses confirming that he believed every word completely, that there was no performance or exaggeration in anything he was saying. He spoke about overriding his own biological limits the way another species might speak about breathing or eating, as something so fundamental that it barely warranted explanation. She left the med bay an hour later and went directly to her quarters, where she sat down at her desk and began pulling files from the Concord's historical database. Everything the galaxy had on record about human combat history, which turned out to be far more than she had expected. She read for 6 hours straight. She read about bare-knuckle boxing in places called England and Ireland, where men fought with nothing but their fists for rounds that sometimes lasted over an hour, until their hands were broken and their faces were unrecognizable, and still they would not stop. She read about an ancient form of combat called pancration, practiced on a peninsula called Greece, where fighters used every part of their bodies as weapons, and the only rules were no biting and no eye gouging. She read about human soldiers in a conflict called the First World War, who fought in trenches filled with poison gas and mud and disease for years without retreating. She read about something called an ultramarathon, where humans voluntarily ran distances of 100 miles or more through deserts and mountains, not because they were fleeing danger or pursuing prey, but because they wanted to test themselves against their own limits. She read about human mothers lifting objects that should have been far too heavy for their bodies in order to save their children, a phenomenon so common that humans had given it a casual name, hysterical strength, as though temporarily exceeding the boundaries of their own biology was just something that happens sometimes. And slowly, as the hours passed and the data accumulated, Thyra began to understand something, that reframed everything she thought she knew about this species. Humans had not developed unarmed combat because they lacked weapons. They had developed it because fighting was woven into their identity at a level so deep that weapons were merely accessories. The body came first. It had always come first. For millions of years, before they built tools or tamed fire or left their homeworld, they had been fighting and running and enduring with nothing but muscle and bone and an evolutionary gift that no other known species possessed: the ability to consciously override their own survival instincts through an act of pure will. Every other species in the Concord had evolved to survive. Humans had evolved to refuse to stop. Thyra turned off her holodisplay and sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about what she was going to write in her report. 2 days later, something happened that surprised the entire station, perhaps even more than the fight itself. Thyra was in the medbay corridor when she heard the heavy, rhythmic footsteps approaching, and knew immediately who it was. Drask Gorhin rounded the corner, his massive frame filling the hallway, his bone plates still bearing faint marks from the arena, scratches and stress fractures where Ethan's fists had found their targets. He walked past Thyra without looking at her, and stopped at the door of Ethan's recovery room. Thyra stayed where she was, at the far end of the corridor, and opened her empathic senses. Drask entered the room, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Thyra could feel both of their emotional states: Ethan's steady warmth and Drask's turbulent mixture of something that the Kralith had no cultural framework to process. A combination of wounded pride and grudging awe, and the slow, painful birth of respect for an enemy who had earned it in the most undeniable way possible. Finally Drask spoke, his deep voice carrying through the open door. "I have fought 100 warriors," the Kralith said, "champions of 6 species, veterans of 30 campaigns. I have broken every one of them." A pause. "You are the first enemy I would follow into battle." Thyra felt the shift that happened between them in that moment. Not friendship, because neither of them were built for easy friendship, but something older and perhaps more honest. It was the recognition that passes between two predators who have tested each other completely and found the other worthy. It was the understanding that real respect can only be forged in the place where one being pushes another to their absolute limit and watches them refuse to break. Ethan's voice came through the door, quiet and steady. "I would be honored to have you beside me, Warlord." Another long silence, and then the sound of Drask's heavy footsteps leaving the room. As the Kralith passed Thyra in the corridor, she felt something from him that she had never felt from a Kralith in her entire career. Humility, raw and new and uncomfortable, like a muscle being used for the very first time. Thyra watched him go, and then she went back to her quarters and began writing the report that would change humanity's place in the galaxy forever. The Concord Military Council convened on the 42nd day of the Standard Cycle, and 12 senior officers from 12 species took their seats in the great circular chamber at the heart of Station Olmara's command level. Holoscreens lined the walls, data streams flickered in the air like digital rain, and at the center of the room stood a single podium where the speaker would present their case. Thyra Velshen stood at that podium with her 4 hands clasped behind her back, and her bioluminescent skin held in the steady, controlled blue of formal address. She had spent the last week preparing this presentation, and every word of it had been chosen with the same precision that Ethan Rourke used to find the gaps in Kralith armor. The council members watched her, with expressions ranging from polite attention to barely concealed impatience. The Kralith representative, not Drask, who had recused himself, but a senior commander named Voth, sat with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. The Orvani representative floated slightly above her chair, her 6 eyes half-lidded in the way that indicated skepticism. The Felhari delegate tapped his claws against the table in a rapid rhythm that Thyra's empathic senses read as restless boredom. They all expected her to recommend the standard outcome: limited auxiliary roles for humans, support positions, logistical assignments. It was the safe recommendation, the expected one, the one that would not upset any existing power structures or challenge any assumptions. Thyra took a breath and began speaking. "Honored council members," she said, "I was assigned to evaluate whether the human species merits a permanent military combat designation within the Galactic Concord. I have completed that evaluation, and I am here to present my findings and my recommendation." She touched a control on the podium, and the holoscreens around the chamber lit up with data: biometric readings, combat footage, physiological analyses, and her own empathic testimony recordings, translated into visual waveforms that even non-empaths could interpret. "I will begin with what I expected to find," she said. "I expected to find a species with no meaningful combat advantages, no natural armor, no enhanced senses, no psionic abilities, no biological weapons, no exceptional speed or strength, and in purely physical terms, this assessment was correct. Humans are soft-skinned, relatively slow, moderately strong, and equipped with sensory capabilities that rank in the lower third of Concord species." She paused and let the data speak for itself. Charts showing humans at the bottom or middle of nearly every physical metric when compared to the other 11 species on the station. The council members nodded. This was what they expected. This was the easy part. "However," Thyra said, and she felt the room's attention sharpen slightly at the shift in her tone, "physical metrics do not tell the complete story of what a species is capable of in combat. I know this because I stood as empathic witness during a Caltherac between Sergeant Ethan Rourke of the human contingent and Warlord Drast Goran of the Kralith. And what I experienced during that engagement has fundamentally altered my understanding of combat potential." She brought up the footage of the fight. Not the full 12 minutes, but key moments. The council watched Ethan slip Drask's charge and strike the nerve cluster beneath his arm plate. They watched him take hit after hit and rise each time. They watched him lock the choke around the Kralith's throat while bleeding from a dozen wounds. Several council members leaned forward in their seats, and Thyra felt interest replacing boredom across the room, like sunlight replacing shadow. "What you are seeing is remarkable enough," Thyra said. "But what you cannot see is what I felt through my empathic connection to both combatants. And it is my testimony as empathic witness that I wish to present as the foundation of my recommendation." She brought up the waveform recordings, her own empathic data, captured in real time during the fight, now translated into patterns that the council could read. "Every species in this Concord fights with some variation of the same emotional architecture," she said. "Aggression drives the attack. Fear modulates the defense. Pain enforces the body's limits. When pain exceeds a biological threshold, the organism ceases combat in order to preserve itself. This is universal across every sentient species we have studied. It is the fundamental equation of combat biology." She pointed to a section of the waveform that represented Ethan's data. "Humans have a different equation." The room was very quiet now. During the Caltherac, Sergeant Rourke sustained injuries that exceeded the combat cessation threshold for every species in the Concord's database, Kralith included. His body registered the pain, transmitted the appropriate neurological signals, and activated every survival mechanism that his biology possessed to compel him to stop fighting. She let that settle for a moment. He overrode all of it. Not through chemical suppression, not through psionic dampening, not through any technological or pharmacological intervention. His mind acknowledged the pain signals, assessed them, and made a deliberate decision to continue operating beyond the parameters his biology had set. And this was not a momentary spike of desperation. He sustained this state for the entire duration of the engagement, and during that time his cognitive function did not degrade. If anything, it sharpened. Thyra pulled up a comparative analysis showing the neurological profiles of warriors from 6 different species during peak combat, alongside Ethan's profile. In every other species, she said, cognitive function declines as physical damage accumulates. This is expected and biologically consistent. The brain prioritizes survival over strategy as the body approaches critical damage. But in the human, we see the opposite. Focus increases, pattern recognition accelerates, adaptive learning intensifies. His brain was not shutting down under pressure. It was operating at a level that exceeded his baseline performance by a significant margin. She looked around the chamber and saw that every council member was now fully engaged. Even the Kralith representative had uncrossed his arms and was staring at the data with an expression that Thyra's empathy read as deep unease. The humans have a term for this state, Thyra continued. They call it a flow state, or sometimes a combat flow state. It is a neurological condition in which the brain enters a mode of hyper-focused operation, suppressing unnecessary input, enhancing relevant processing, and allowing the body to perform at levels that exceed normal capacity. It is not unique to combat. Humans can enter this state during artistic creation, athletic competition, problem-solving, and numerous other activities. But in combat, it transforms them into something that our existing classifications are not equipped to categorize. She brought up her final data set, not combat data, but historical records. The council watched footage and read accounts of human endurance and combat throughout their species' history. Bare-knuckle fighters who went 75 rounds with broken hands. Soldiers who continued fighting after sustaining wounds that should have been immediately fatal. Runners who crossed deserts on foot because they refused to stop. Climbers who ascended the tallest mountains on their planet in conditions that killed most other living things that attempted it. This is not an anomaly, Thyra said. Sergeant Rourke is not an exceptional human. He is a representative one. The ability to override biological limits through conscious will is not a rare mutation in their species. It is a standard feature. Every human possesses it to some degree. It is the product of 10 million years of evolution on a world that was actively hostile to their survival at every stage of their development. A world filled with predators that were faster, stronger, better armed, and better armored than they were, in every possible way. They survived anyway. They did not survive because they evolved better weapons, or harder skin, or sharper teeth. They survived because they evolved the one trait that no predator on their world could match: the refusal to accept defeat as a biological inevitability. And they carried that trait with them when they left their planet. And they carry it with them now on this station, in their quiet training rooms, where they wrap cloth around their hands and practice hitting things until their knuckles scar over. The chamber was absolutely silent. Thyra straightened her posture and delivered the conclusion she had been building toward for the past 20 minutes. Every species in this concord built weapons to overcome their physical limitations. Humans built weapons to complement a body that was already at war. Strip them bare, break their bones, and back them into a corner, and you will discover what 10 million years of survival against a death world has forged. They are not fragile. Her bioluminescent markings flared bright white as she spoke the next words. They are restrained, and we should be grateful for that. She let the silence hold for 5 full seconds, and then she said the words that sent a visible shock through the council chamber. I do not recommend combat designation for the human species. I recommend apex designation. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. The Felhari delegate made a sound like cracking glass. The Orvani representative's 6 eyes all opened fully for the first time. Even the Kralith representative shifted in his seat, with a grinding of bone plates that echoed through the suddenly noisy room. Apex designation, the highest combat classification in the Concord, reserved for species whose combat capabilities were considered unmatched in their category. Only 3 species had ever held it: the Kralith, the Thesari, and the long-extinct Voron. No species had been granted apex designation in over 300 standard years. The council debated for 4 hours. Thyra answered every question with data, testimony, and the steady conviction of someone who had felt the truth of her recommendation burning inside another being's chest. The Kralith representative argued against it, not with the contempt that Drask had once shown, but with genuine concern about what it would mean for the existing power structures. The Orvani representative asked probing questions about human psychology and whether this override capability made them unstable. The Felhari wanted to know if humans could be provoked into using it uncontrollably. Thyra answered them all, and when the debate finally ended and the votes were cast, the result was 9-3 in favor. Humans received apex designation, the first species in 300 years to earn it. The announcement spread across Station Olmara within minutes, and across the wider Concord within hours. On every deck of the station, beings who had walked past the human section without a second glance now stopped and looked through the training room windows with new eyes, watching the same push-ups and sparring drills and cloth-wrapped fists hitting heavy bags that they had once dismissed as the exercises of a lesser species. Ethan Rourke heard the news in the medbay, where he was completing his final round of regenerative treatment. His soldiers told him with faces that were bright with pride and voices that cracked with emotion, and he listened to them with a quiet smile, and nodded and said, "Good. Now get back to training." SH. The command staff offered him a promotion, a leadership position at Concord Central, a prestigious posting that would put him at the heart of galactic military operations. He declined. They offered him a diplomatic role as humanity's military representative to the council. They asked him what he wanted, and he said he wanted to go back to his training room. And so he did. Thyra found him there on her last day on Station Olmara, before she shipped out to her next assignment. He was standing barefoot on the training mat, demonstrating a basic fighting stance to a group of young human soldiers who had just arrived on the station, fresh-faced, nervous, and looking at their scarred sergeant with the kind of awe that bordered on worship. "Feet apart," he was saying. "Weight balanced. Hands up. Elbows in. Breathe. Always breathe. The moment you stop breathing, your body starts shutting down. And we do not shut down." Thyra stood in the doorway and watched him for a long time, and through her empathic senses, she felt the steady warmth that she had come to recognize as uniquely his. Not the furnace, not the white-hot fire of combat focus, but the quiet version of it. The ember that the fire banked down to when the fighting was done and the living continued. He noticed her and paused his lesson. "Commander," he said, "I heard you are leaving." "I am," she said. "I came to say something before I go." "Witnessing your fight changed something fundamental in my understanding of this galaxy," she said. And she spoke carefully, because this mattered to her in a way that very few things in her career ever had. "I have been an empath for my entire adult life, and I have felt the inner experiences of hundreds of beings from dozens of species. And what I felt inside you during that fight was the most extraordinary thing I have encountered." He was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful, and then he asked, "What did it feel like from your side?" Thyra considered the question, really considered it, searching through her vocabulary in 3 languages for words that could contain what she had experienced. And in the end, the best she could find were these. It felt like standing inside a star that refused to burn out. Ethan looked at her, and something passed between them that was not romance and not friendship, but something rarer. The recognition between 2 beings who had shared an experience so intense that it had permanently altered them both. He smiled, just slightly, just enough to shift the scars on his knuckles, and then he turned back to his students and went back to wrapping his hands. Thyra left Station Ulnara that afternoon. 3 weeks later, a new training module appeared on the Concord military network, broadcast to every garrison, every outpost, every warship and training academy in the galaxy. It was listed under the newly created category of Apex Combat Fundamentals, and it was titled simply, Unarmed Combat Doctrine, Human. The introductory footage showed a modest training room with a single mat on the floor. Ethan Rourke stood barefoot in the center of it, his scarred hands raised in a basic fighting stance, his expression calm and steady and completely unremarkable. Just a man. Just a human. Just a member of a species that the galaxy had once dismissed as soft and fragile and beneath notice. He looked into the camera and said 7 words that would be quoted in military academies across the Concord for generations to come. The weapon is your decision to keep going. The galaxy watched. The galaxy learned. And across the stars, in quiet training rooms and crowded barracks and lonely outposts on the edges of known space, humans wrapped cloth around their hands and raised their fists and smiled, because they had always known what they were, and now the rest of the universe was finally beginning to understand.